How does one cope with their akhirah with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if they forgave the family members who have wronged them but do not want to be in their presence? How do you cope with family members who genuinely feel they have not wronged anyone, play the victim, and believe all your hardships are because you set clear boundaries? I have heard that if someone breaks family ties, all their obligatory deeds and extra deeds will not be counted, and I want to have a relationship with Allah because of His mercy, but I am also scared of His wrath.
Yeah, I appreciate this question very much. And certainly it's one that I find that comes up quite a bit actually in counseling. And what happens when you have in our field we call them interpersonal relationships with people who are, loved ones of yours, family members of yours, blood kin of yours that have transgressed or have, stepped over bounds that are not appropriate and may not even be able to see that that's the case. And then there's a question of, in Islam, there's all this focus on sulat al-rahim, right? Kind of these blood relationships that tie us together. And I'll share with you something that I loved from hearing from my teachers on this concept of sulat al-rahim. And what they're talking about, these kind of like these ties, literally the sila, what is a sila? It is a connection or a tie. And I'm answering the last part of the question first, I believe, but bear with me. This concept of the sila or the connection, when you're saying to break the ties, which really is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us not to do, it has to do with, think about a connection, right? For you to sever it is a complete and full sever. And when you do that purposefully, and you do that, um, you know, whether it's right or wrong, but you actually completely and fully sever, this is where we start getting into some of the issues related to the, qata rahim, or basically cutting the ties. And in this case, if you are somebody who, I tell people that I counsel all the time, if you have somebody in your family that has done something egregious, that's really difficult, there is nothing in Islam that tells you that you must be able to be in their company and spend all this time with them at all, actually. In fact, what Islam tells you to do is not to put yourself ever in a place in which you're going to be demeaned. And so what is that? Where does that leave you? How do you kind of balance the two things? Well, part of it is if you are not the one severing the ties. And you know what that means? To keep a connection, literally keep the sila is a connection. And what that literally sometimes could look like is, Assalamu alaikum, Eid Mubarak, Ramadan Mubarak. That is keeping a connection at its bare minimum. And in that way, you haven't severed the ties. But you've also protected yourself from the harm of this person that has been continuously harming you, because Allah has told you on the other side of it, right? Just as He's told you don't sever ties, He's also told you do not put yourself in harm's way. And so there is a balance. It's a fine balance. It is one that you have to kind of like weigh, but you can actually do this. And if somebody else severs the ties, that's not on you, as long as you've tried. You give the salam, you try, you pick up the phone once a year, right? You try. And so and this is where I would actually, beyond what I've just said here, and I would really like to see what Dr. Shadee will share too, this is where I often say to people, look, if what I'm explaining like kind of theoretically makes sense, but you're like, I don't know how to actually put this into practice, this might be a moment of really turning to ourselves and saying, to the earlier verses I was mentioning about Sayyidina Yusuf and self-advocacy, this is where it might be time to actually essentially advocate for yourself and say, I need some extra help with this. And there's a reason why there are professionals who are trained in family relations, right? Who are trained to help people with interpersonal relationships that have been disrupted, people that have transgressed and have done things that are inappropriate, to help not just help you kind of move forward in your own life, but even Islamically integrate how do you then cope with some of these things, move forward in a healthy way, and be able to see that person in a family setting and not completely kind of break down and melt down when you see them either. So I hope, inshallah, that kind of gives us the impetus to say, look, we should get help when we need the help around these things.
You mentioned in your bio, actually, you also help with the Marston Foundation, right? So a lot of that is just like if you have the moment and time, those who are asking these questions, because a lot of you are asking similarly phrased questions about forgiveness, family, mental health issues in the community and yourself. I would definitely reach out to Dr. Rania through marston.org. There's also wonderful resources on their website that you can definitely check out. It's not something that can be easily answered in one session, but it was beautifully phrased. Dr. Rania, Jazakumullah khairan. Dr. Shadi, anything additional to add?
A little nugget that people could always keep in mind is that you're not allowed to break ties, but you are allowed to avoid harm. And you have to do both. You don't break the tie. That means, like Dr. Anya said, a salam and some connection every once in a while, but you are allowed in Sharia to avoid harm. If I'm going to be made fun of at this gathering, I could leave early. I could not go at all. I could just call in sick or something like that. So you have to find the way to do that. And that's why, again, we mentioned earlier that whenever things are relative, you always want to ask the people of knowledge that you live with in your time and place. This is where the best, because these are going to be judgment call scenarios, not rulings. There's a difference between judgment call scenarios and rulings. You're not going to find an answer in a book. That's why in our religion requires human contact, right? So that you can ask those judgment call questions.